everybody. I am Simon Majumdar, and welcome to a brand new episode of Eat My Globe, a podcast that tells you everything that you didn't know about food. And on today's very special episode, I am delighted to introduce you all to Debra Freeman. Now, Debra is a food anthropologist, a writer like me, and like me, a podcaster. She particularly looks at food that originates in Virginia, one of my favorite places in the US, but also looks at the greater South in general. Like me, she's again fascinated by the impact of race, culture, and food. And she talks about this on her own podcast, Setting the Table. So I can't wait to introduce you all to the one and only Debra Freeman. Welcome. But with your respect, and you have this real love for African-American food, it's not surprising that you have a podcast, you have this fantastic writing career, and you really describe yourself as a food anthropologist, which is something I try to be, but I'm not really. I just do this as a kind of hobby, really. Although there's nearly 80-something plus episodes, so I guess it's not too much of a hobby. So perhaps before we can look at your choices, and for people listening, we've asked you to come back with 5 people or 5, in this case, aspects of people and so before we do, tell us a little bit about your podcast, what that covers, and about your writing career, which I have to say makes me very jealous because you've covered a lot of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am the host of a podcast, which is called Setting the Table. And Setting the Table, it really, we just finished our first season probably a couple months ago. And really what I wanted to do through the podcast is make the argument that African Americans laid the foundation for American food as we know it. And through each particular episode, I talk about things that you might take for granted, like barbecue or macaroni and cheese, or even certain desserts. Those all are connected to Black hands and to Black people in general. And so that's really what I want to do. And so I was really fortunate enough to have some really cool guests on to really walk me and the listener through why this is an accurate assertion. And I also try to do that through my writing. And so I've written for like a bunch of publications, but the through line between everything I write, if it's about collard greens or spoon bread or yellow cake, is really how does that relate to the African American experience, and really trying to tell those stories in a holistic way.
Well, I think just from what I read and listening to your podcast, it's an amazing thing that you're doing, because I think a lot of people on the white background of things don't even realize that this is where the food comes from. And I think we're going to talk about that, I think, with our challenges today, particularly, I think, with the first one. But when you talk about a lot of the people, we'll let the people find out what we're going to talk about as we go on. But coming from an Indian background as well, in England, I look at chicken tikka masala. I look at these things that come out of the British perspective, and I try and tell that as well from the British perspective. So it's a really interesting view. So what we're going to do, folks, is we're going to go through the African-American foodways, I think, and we're going to talk about those. So why don't we just get down to the choices? Because you put some ones that I know, and you put some that I didn't know, which was fascinating for me, because my great passion is to go online or to go everywhere and just find out about them. And so it was really, really passionate. But you came up, I think, with the first one with a group of people, which I thought was exciting, and really where Q starts from, I think. And so why don't you tell us who your first choices in the kind of Eat My Globe experience are?
Yeah. So number one, my first round draft pick would be pit masters, and the early enslaved pit masters. And so, twofold. One, I make the argument that barbecue starts in Virginia. I have lots of documentations and arguments for that, but even more importantly than place, the where is the who. And so it's those early African Americans who are digging the pits, who are creating the coals, who are tending to those hogs and other meats as well, but primarily hogs when it starts out in Virginia.
Yep.
They are the ones doing that work. And so they are laying the foundation for American barbecue, because as African Americans are sold throughout the South, they're taking their techniques with them. And so you're going to Alabama, you're going to Georgia, you're going to South Carolina, but you're taking all of those traditions with you. And then later in the Great Migration, even expands to St. Louis, to Chicago, to Kansas City. So all of these traditions come from Virginia pitmasters. And so I really think that people don't necessarily think about, well, where does this kind of come from? But it's really a fascinating story. And so, these men and some women, not very many women, it wasn't very well documented, unfortunately, but these men and women really do set the stage for something that people all around the world identify as American.
And what I wanted to ask you about that, first of all, let's just get the elephant out of the room and talk about Texas, because that comes as a very different style of barbecue. It's German, and I want to know whether it's related to barbecue as it was in Virginia, whether it operated as a separate kind of, I don't know, a separate kind of enterprise as itself, or whether I don't know where it came from, or whether it came out of the Virginia barbecue.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't. And you are correct about the German influences and Eastern European influences. That's where Texas barbecue comes from those migrants coming over and using their smoking techniques. That is completely different than what's going on in Virginia with the slow cooking, and indirect heat versus direct heat. So that's definitely the difference. But those things are going on simultaneously after Texas is established much later. But, 150, 200 years prior is where Virginia is really setting the stage for barbecue, because Texas barbecue is a whole different thing.
Oh yeah, it really is, and it is a totally different thing. I'm a great fan of both. I'm a huge fan. People may not know this, but I used to be on a barbecue team at the Kansas City Royal. So, people don't know this about me, because they see me on Iron Chef and all of this, eating fine food, but barbecue is one of my great passions. I have a few questions, and since you mentioned one in your talk there, let's talk about the women's side. So I think about barbecue, even as an enslaved community, whether it was done on a day off, I don't even know if they had a day off, but whether it was separate. So it was something the men did when they were, and gave the women some time off, or the fact is, even then, the men were cooking something that the women weren't, which I found very extraordinary.
Yeah, I think that is interesting, because cooking obviously was known as domestic work, but this was something almost a little different, because I think the strength that it takes to flip a 80-pound hog, or to chop down the tree, to get to the coals, to burn it, it's really labor intensive. I can't even imagine what it must have been like without modern equipment and modern tools to be able to do that. But there was one woman in particular, her name was Mandy. She was actually married to Juba Garth, who was an enslaved man here in Virginia. And they were a husband and wife kind of cooking team, if you will. And so she's the only one that we have uncovered and found. I'm sure there were others, but it was very rare. But yeah, typically this was a men's activity. I'm sure there were women, but we just haven't found documentation for it.
Well, that's interesting. And what's interesting now is there are a great number of women in barbecue now. So Diva Barbecue is a good friend of mine. You've got a lot of people around. So what I love is that women are really getting into barbecue now. And I think that's really important. The other question I have a few questions, but so someone, and this is somebody in Senegal, when I was there in Senegal, someone told me, which is that the barbecue came from African Americans, or in the US, and also Caribbean Americans or Caribbeans coming into the US, and the Caribbean barbacoa and all of that stage as well coming in. And I just don't know enough about it, but I wonder if you'd found out anything about that.
Yeah, so that's not true.
Okay, that's great. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, different countries have different traditions, but barbecue, as it started in American barbecue as we know it, there's such a unique coming together of the enslaved Africans and later African Americans, the indigenous people and their smoking techniques, and the Europeans who brought over pigs and vinegar, which is a key component to early American barbecue. So that wasn't happening anywhere else in the world. That was happening in Virginia. And no, no, I don't want to talk badly about your friend, but that's not accurate.
hey, he's a good pal, but he's someone you can talk badly about, so that's fine. Because I didn't know it, and I was like, oh, okay, well that makes some sense, but it doesn't in this. And the other thing, I when we talk about it becoming an American food, and it's become the American cuisine. We have the Southern cuisine, which absolutely. But this now has gone all over the United States. I live in California, and it is huge now in California. The whether it's the Memphis style or the Kansas City style, or primarily here it's the separate side, the Texas style. But I want to know, how did this cuisine, and it is a cuisine, become the huge thing that is in America right now? Certainly within the last 5 years, it's become this amazing thing, and here's something that came out of the enslaved occupation in Virginia. And I just find that really genuinely remarkable in such a huge country. So have you done much to explain that? Have you looked at that? I mean, I'd love to know how it became this unique American cuisine.
Yeah, I think that because it's something, first of all, it's delicious, right? So let's, so that's the simple answer, right? But I think if you delve a little bit deeper, and particularly in the past few years, as you mentioned, I think the rise of food media over the past probably decade has really kind of picked people out who are kind of your stars, if you will. So, like your Rodney Scott, he's a household name at this point, and so people like that. And so I think that people are trying to replicate that. And I think that, because grills became kind of accessible in the 50s. And so people are out in the backyards and they're grilling. And so they're barbecuing, not in the traditional sense of like digging a pit and that whole thing, but, barbecue kind of became a verb versus a noun, if you will. And so, and so I think that has just kind of endured. And so hot dogs and hamburgers become barbecue, quote unquote, right? And so I think that's synonymous with those Southern styles that we were kind of talking about. I think that has just lent it so that it's not only all over the country, but it's lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years.
I love the fact that you did choose, the early Black pitmasters for the way that you start, because funnily enough, when I talked about to Duff Goldman the other day, he came in and he said, okay, my first ones are the early people who bake bread. He goes, that's it. So it's the same kind of routine there. You've got these early Black pitmasters, many of whom just aren't known. You just have to go but the fact is they created this whole cuisine. So since I'm gonna do it, where's my pen? I'm going to go and mark that one off in my thing, and I think that's good. Now we're going to come to your second one, which is James Hemings. Now, I know James Hemings because of my study doing this show and reading about it, but I'd love you to tell just our audience, who we have a lot of you, really who James Hemings is and what he did, because I think he did just an amazing thing, because he contributed in a very short life so much towards the American cuisine again. So please tell us about James Hemings.
Yeah, absolutely. So James Hemings was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson. And so when he was 19, Thomas Jefferson took him to study food in Paris. And when Jefferson was ambassador to France. And so while he's there, he learns how to speak French fluently, but more importantly, he learns from French pastry chefs and from royal chefs how to make French cuisine that Jefferson absolutely loved. And so he learns this, all of these skills. He's there for a couple of years, comes back to Virginia, to Monticello, where Jefferson lives, and then essentially is recreating these dishes in what someone wrote as a half Virginian, half French style. And so he's making things that we still eat today. So he brought back creme brulee, French fries, macaroni and cheese, whipped cream. So these things, again, that linger hundreds and hundreds of years, they come from basically one person bringing them over and cooking them and teaching that, to his brother, Peter, who became the chef later, and the other women in the kitchen. And so that is how we get these dishes in America.
And this is what I wanted to talk about first. First of all, I mean, he was an enslaved man, but he goes over to Paris. And I understand that in Paris, he became a freed man. And then he came back to Paris where he was an enslaved man again. Was that something that you kind of know about? Or is that just, how does he do that with Thomas Jefferson? Or he just came back to be an enslaved man again? I just found that very weird, shall we say, that he did that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought about it. I read an article about it a few years ago, and I got to that portion of his life and was really trying to figure out, why would you come back? You're being paid well in France. You know the language, and you see free Black people walking around. And what I can only come up with, the only answer I can come up with is family. His family is back here in Virginia. And he doesn't want to be apart from them. His sister, Sally Hemings, is there in France, and she's going back to Virginia with Jefferson. And so I really think is the tie of a family that brings him back to be kind of willing to be enslaved again. That is really the only thing I can come up with. Because otherwise, why would you,
No, exactly. And I thought about this, and I hadn't thought about family. But I was thinking about why he went back. Was he allowed more freedom? But it's still an enslaved community. So I just never thought about that. And it's something I think we have to talk about, but it's an extraordinary one. So he came over to France. Let's talk about France a little bit, because again, a person coming over to France. Yes, there were freed Black people there, and it was they had Côte d'Ivoire. They had a number of places that they had, and they brought those people over to France. But let's talk about him. He's 19. He's going over to France. He's going over, and I mention it in my notes here, a particular purpose. That's what he's called. That's what Thomas Jefferson calls him. And he goes to cook by these amazing chefs in France. Let's just talk about that for a while. He's going at 19 to talk about this incredible food that he's learning there. I mean, what do you think? And this is a kind of a gesture thing, but what do you think he's thinking then?
Well, I think, one, all indications point to him being very intelligent, very quick, very astute. So I imagine that he's soaking all of this up, and I imagine there's a bit of culture shock as well, because, you're seeing these free Black people, and obviously, Monticello, which is a little more pastoral versus a bustling city like Paris. So I can only imagine what that must have been like for him. But, I think that he is just really soaking it all in. And I think that, the early, the precursor to the stoves that the French are using, he's never seen anything like that before, and I imagine that he's thinking, oh, my goodness, what is this? How do you use it? And, he's just soaking up all of that knowledge from all of the French chefs. And I think that he may have been a little overwhelmed, but it also says to me that the money that he was paid by Jefferson, he chose to spend it on French lessons that says to me that he really wanted to understand and know what was going on, and really just soak up all of that information. So I think he was probably going through a lot of emotional things all at once, but it does speak, I think, to his determination to really kind of bear down and focus and learn these things. And apparently he was very, very good at it.
Yes, I mean, one of the things I wanted to kind of just touch upon was his emotions. I actually had that word written down, and his emotions coming over as a 19-year-old over to France must have been really extraordinary, as it would be for anyone now. And yet he was an enslaved man. He was, I don't know what his background was. And then he comes into this, I think was a really remarkable thing. But I want to, first of all, let's talk about his death, because we have to talk about why he died. He was what, 36? I want
36.
to say.
Yeah, 36.
And he died outside of Thomas Jefferson's home, I believe in New York, but I may have got that wrong.
Yeah, he committed suicide in Baltimore, actually. And so,
okay.
And so at this point, he's working at a tavern, which, in the 1800s is not necessarily where you want to be, and I often think about, you've trained in France with the best chefs arguably in the world. And then the only work that you can have or find is to basically work in a bar, and what I can't even imagine what that must have been like, because there's just such a shift of, from elegance and the pomp and circumstance of it all to go to creating bar food within the span of a few years. And so he was free at that point because he negotiated for his freedom, and Jefferson set him free. But I imagine that must have been very hard to deal with. And I imagine that's probably part of why he decided to take his own life.
Yeah, it was something that I read about that. And I believe as well that he was alcoholic as well, wasn't he? So So here we have this amazing man who, even in 36 years, has lived probably more than we have. And he's just developing this alcohol problem, the commitment to suicide. But let's
can I say one quick thing? And the other thing that I think might add to is he might have felt a sense of guilt, because part of the bargain for him to be free was he had to train his brother to take his place. And so here he is, a free man, and you're training your brother Peter to still be a slave. So I think I think there may have, total conjecture, but I imagine there's probably a sense of guilt that's associated with that as well.
Wow, I didn't realize, and this is the fascinating story then, that he was training Peter to be his a slave. I didn't realize that Peter wasn't free at this point. That's remarkable.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I mean, I'm going to talk about what he wanted in terms of the food. But do we know how Peter ended up then? Because I just don't know about this. And then we'll talk about the wonderful things that he left us, because I think that's a good way to leave it. But did Peter live, a much longer life? Was he, a grateful person? Did he end up coming out of enslavement? I just don't know. So please tell us.
Yeah, so Peter actually, he winds up cooking, and then he later teaches other women to cook in the same style. But Peter, he's really interesting because his talent is in brewing. So he's known as just this incredible brewer, and Jefferson notes this in some of his journals. And so I think people don't really think about that, which is really unfortunate, because he had talent of his own as well. And so I believe that he was ultimately sold as well and was not freed, because when Jefferson died, he was in a lot of debt. And unfortunately, a lot of his slaves were sold to kind of make up for that debt on Monticello.
Oh, I didn't know any of this side of it. So, well, first of all, let's give praise to Peter, because he was obviously an amazing person. But let's finish off with James. Let's talk about some of the food that he he brought into this country. Let's talk about where they've gone, where they are now, all of these things that we all love. And it's because of James Hemings, who was an enslaved man, and when he came back to the US and really brought these foods to us. So let's talk about some of those foods if we can.
Yeah, so I think the most, at least for me, near and dear to my heart is macaroni and cheese. So I absolutely love baked macaroni and cheese because there's a difference between kind of your stovetop and baked, but that's a different discussion for a different day. But essentially, it starts off as macaroni pie, so it's the precursor to macaroni and cheese. But it's very similar. It's baked, it's custardy in a way, it's cheese and pasta. And so, as time goes on, it becomes it becomes more seasoned. So the macaroni and cheese evolves into essentially an American staple. French fries, like who does not associate America with French fries? And so, he wasn't the first person to create potatoes like that, but the first person that we can find in America that's eating potatoes in that way. And so, creme brulee. That's another thing. And so all of these really beautiful dishes that endure from France, we would not have, here in America if it weren't for James Hemings.
Well, I think despite his early passing, despite alcoholism, all the things, let's concentrate on the food. He really did, I think, brought some amazing food to the United States. So thank you for him for that.
Yeah.
Hi everybody, this is Simon Majumdar, the creator and host of the Eat My Globe Food History podcast. Now, those of you who have been listening to the podcast since we began over 2 years ago, nearly 50 episodes so far, will know that we have never sought out sponsorship for the podcast. It's very much been a labour of love. However, along the way, a large number of people have approached us suggesting they would like to support the podcast. And so, we have opened up a page on patreon.com to allow those of you who listen regularly to do just that. Any support we will get will allow us to purchase research materials, buy ingredients for recipes, and maybe, when we can get out and about, to bring you some very special in-the-field reporting. But, and this is really important, this is not just a one-way street. For varying levels of membership of our Patreon club, there will be access to fantastic Eat My Globe swag, including that incredible chopping board so many of you have written to me about, recipes based on historical periods about which we chat each week, video shout-outs, signed pictures, and even along the way some very special episodes just for members. So, if you've enjoyed the episodes of Eat My Globe you've listened to so far, and would like us to make many more into the future, do head over to www.patreon.com/eatmyglobe and consider taking out a membership. Any support will be much appreciated. Remember, that's www.patreon.com/eatmyglobe. So thank you very much. Keep listening. And now we get to someone who, in a way, is she was La Grande Dame for food. You tell us about Edna Lewis.
Yes, and so I smile because this is yet another Virginia person. Just, I don't know if you're noticing a trend here, but yeah.
all delightful to have.
But yeah, so Edna Lewis, she's actually born, in a place that wasn't actually far from Monticello, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, I mean, she is such a fascinating person, in my opinion. Everyone thinks about Julia Child and that sort of thing, but I think that it's Edna Lewis because her story is insane. I mean, you're starting off, you're born in a small town that's created by formerly enslaved people.
Yes.
You move to New York and you work at a communist newspaper as a typist. Like, what? And then you're creating dresses for Marilyn Monroe. And this is all before you become a chef.
Yeah.
I cannot even imagine what that would look like in movie form. But she was really extraordinary because in a culinary way, because she really does introduce the country through her cookbooks, seasonal cooking and Southern cooking in a way that hadn't really been done before. And so it's just there, you really cannot quantify really the effect that she had on American cooking. And more people need to kind of celebrate her. I think there was a time where it was like a blip where people knew who she was. And then, it's kind of gone away a little bit, but really her contribution cannot be, you can't even quantify it.
Well, for me, and I did know about her, but I didn't before I did an episode on women in food. She's a remarkable character. I mean, the fact is, she was called La Grande Dame of Southern Cuisine, La Dame Escoffier, and yet what I find really hard is in the last few years, people have forgotten about her.
Mm-hmm.
Not people like you, a food anthropologist, which is great, but people have really forgotten about her as just this remarkable cook, the woman who wrote these amazing, 3 cookbooks now she wrote. And the middle one, I think, is the one that everyone, and I have a copy of it somewhere. It is a remarkable book, and that was the one I think that took her to popularity. But could you tell everyone about her life a little? You talked about it there, but I mean, you touched on it. But her life was just an extraordinary life. And I think, like you said, as a movie, it's an amazing film. But tell us about her life, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's so interesting, it's so when she goes to New York, and so speaking of, again, from the culinary perspective, and so when she begins cooking, she's making dishes for, Tennessee Williams and like these really brilliant artistic people of the day in New York, and she's introducing them to food that they've never even thought about, what I mean? Yeah. And so, I mean, think about, I don't know, a spoon bread, in New York in the 1950s, like that's what.
Yeah.
And so she really expands, I think, what Southern cooking is, because it's more than your fried chicken. It's more than the macaroni and cheese. It's really a very delicate and flavorful and very based on the seasons and what's growing at the time. I think people don't necessarily, I think it's very on trend right now, but 50 years ago, that was simply not the case. No one thought about it in that way. And as a matter of fact, they thought of Southern foods kind of like the stepchild, and like the kind of, throwaway food over there. Who's eating that? But it's really, an intelligent food, an intelligent way and creative way to make food, and that's also delicious. And so I think that she really, for me, is the person that spearheads that through those cookbooks. But absolutely extraordinary that she kind of single-handedly, as a Black woman, like does this and introduces this to the country.
I think for me, it was reading about the fact that, before that, when there were Southern cookbooks, they were always written by white people who, took all the information from a lot of Black people but then passed it off as their own. I mean, or at least showed it as their own. And I wonder about that. I mean, obviously, a lot of the Black ladies who were doing it, and particularly ladies, weren't being given any influence, weren't being given any of that. And so I wonder how it feels to the Black women who showed that. I mean, they were amazing personalities. I mean, do you think that was something that Edna Lewis thought about when she came in to write her own cookbooks?
I can't imagine that she didn't think about it. I mean, she's the granddaughter of enslaved people, so what she's eating, where she's from, where she grew up, that is all from slavery and from that kind of background. So I can't imagine that she did not think about or feel the impact of what she was doing. Even though, some people say, oh, she's just cooking her family's food, but it's so much more than that. Like all of those things, In Pursuit of Flavor, which is personally my preferred cookbook of hers, but she's telling stories of even my childhood. Like that cookbook is a snapshot of not only Southern food but Virginian food. Like because it's so specific. Like she's naming Virginia spots, which is a fish here that everyone eats and it's super common. Like she is really opening the door to that, and so I cannot imagine that was not prevalent in her mind at the time when she decided to share not only her recipes, but stories of how she grew up and how her family was cooking at the time. I can't imagine it wasn't top of mind.
I hope if she was around now, she would be amazing. She would be, yes, she is, but she would be astonishing now. People would know all about her. They would be, because she was a character. She was and I wonder if you thought she was around now, how you think she would be, I'm just saying that because I just wonder if she was born out of her time.
Yeah, I think maybe just a little too soon, right? Like, I think that she would probably be, the face of Food Network, maybe by this point, because what she did was so influential. And, for chefs today to even continue to reference her books and her work, and it frames like Mashama Bailey, she wrote the foreword to In Pursuit of Flavor. And, to think that years and years later, that influenced and the way she thought about food. And, she would be a huge star. She would definitely be on, the front of magazines and people would know who she was. And it wouldn't be like, Edna Lewis, wait, that might sound familiar. No, she would be like Oprah.
Yeah, I really do believe that. So here's the thing to people who are listening at home who don't know Edna Lewis. They need to go out. They need to find. You can find. Any of the books are worthwhile. So I'm not suggesting that any of them aren't. I do love Taste of Country Cooking. If you're out there, go and find them. You may have to look in. And this is crazy. You may have to look in like thrift stores or just to find them. But you do have to go to bookstores. Go and find them, look at them. They are amazing cookbooks. You need to have them in your collection. If you have a recipe collection, you need to go and find them. They are really, really astonishing cookbooks. And they changed the way that we looked at, Southern food. They really did. So that's my suggestion of many I'm going to do today, I'm sure. But go and look at those books. They are fantastic. Please do that for me. Now, we're going to talk about your fourth person, and this is someone I had no idea about. So, apart from the fact that I'm hard pressed to speak about oysters because I've been allergic to them for a long time, and I have many stories about that. When I tried to have one in Scotland and all types of places, and I got very ill. So we won't talk about that necessarily, but I just didn't know about Thomas Downing. So. Please, for me and for everyone, please tell us about him because he was a remarkable person.
Oh, my goodness. Thomas Downing, I found out about him a few years ago. And yes, another Virginian.
Hey, it's no problem. There is no problem here. I promise you. This is great.
So he's born in 1790 in Virginia, and he grew up fishing and oystering, that sort of thing. He heads to Philadelphia and then later New York, and he's an oyster farmer. But he creates an oyster house. So pre-Downing, there were oyster cellars, which were really grungy bar, whatever is underneath bar. So I guess a dive bar kind of thing. They were not places where women, of good reputation went. And, oysters, it's true. Oysters were seen as, food for poor people and not very trendy, much like lobsters were at the time. And so essentially he creates an oyster house in New York, in Manhattan, and it's opulent, it's beautiful, and he's creating these dishes that, terrapins and poultry stuffed with oysters, these really elevated,
Yep.
beautiful dishes. And so because it was close to Wall Street, he had really wealthy people come in and taste his food. And so that's kind of how his popularity grows. And so in my opinion, and I have made this argument before, he's changed the way Americans look at oysters and fine dining. And so, because before him, it was trash, essentially. And after him, you're eating it, on a bed of ice with champagne. And so that is all due to Thomas Downing.
And what I love about Thomas Downing, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about this because people may not know, he deliberately set it up on top of the what do you call it? Let me get this right. Sorry, I can't get it right. The Underground Railway.
Mm-hmm.
And tell us a bit about the Underground Railway and what that means, to people to the African American community, because it was very, very special.
Absolutely. So prior to the Civil War, when African Americans were still enslaved, something came about called the Underground Railroad, which is basically hideouts, if you will. It was a connection of people that led from the South to the North. So people who had safe houses and safe areas for people who were running away to essentially stay. And so you would kind of get passed on and know where the next house was. Someone would tell you, where you need to go, where it would be safe for you to hide, to sleep, to get some food before you went to the next stop, quote unquote. And so Thomas Downing's Oyster House was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And so while white patrons are dining and drinking champagne and, in all this opulence, in the basement were enslaved people who were hiding and resting and eating and really just trying to become free people on their way to Canada and beyond. So it's really remarkable that there's this dichotomy going on simultaneously. And the diners never knew. They never found out what was going on, in the basement. And so that's what, for me, makes the story even more special. Not only is this man, incredible in changing something in American food, but he's clever enough to hide this in plain sight and really make sure that people are safe on their way to freedom.
I love the fact that, yes, as this, I guess, wealthy man, he was running this beautiful place, but underneath it, he was actively helping people. And this was one of the things I wanted to talk about, because, I just went and did some research on him. He was a member of the Commission of 13, a society to protect those who would be kidnapped in the North and sold in the South, which I never knew about. I knew about that kidnapping, but I didn't know about that. And a Society of Anti-Slavery in New York. So, this guy was well known. He was talking, and yet he was still running this underground railroad behind it, which was amazing. And I've asked this. I asked this in a small way with you now, but the difference between the North and the South then must have been extraordinary between the, and you live in the South and you love the South and you love all the food, but it must have been, extraordinary then. And I just come because, I've been watching the Ken Bruce and I've been looking at all of those things. How would that feel to live in the South?
Yeah, it's challenging, and so to talk about the past, the South is largely, agricultural. It's less urban. There are less opportunities for African Americans, whereas the North is industrialized. It's very urban. It's a quicker pace. And so although the further north you go, there are anti-slavery laws in states that are not bordering what becomes known as the Confederacy later. It still was anti-Black. So it wasn't like it was a refuge or, in Eden or anything like that. But even the smallest, bit more of opportunity, you were willing to take that chance to try, to create a better life for yourself and for your family. And so, present day, speaking for myself, it is challenging because it is a place I love and it has very deep culture and roots and beauty, but at the same time, it's incredibly problematic in some ways, and so there's this push and pull that goes on, I think, with a lot of African Americans in the South who, this is where you grew up, this is your home, but at the same time, that there's a history there where you weren't wanted, respected, treated equally. So there's a push and pull that goes on a lot that's a little difficult to navigate at times.
Yeah. And it feels very strange coming from California, which relatively in LA is a very kind of cosmopolitan, and they accept me, who's an Indian. We just see all of this come together. We find it very hard, I think, genuinely very hard to look at. Yeah. Well, now we're going to move on because we're going to have one more person, and then I'm going to ask you some kind of general questions. But we are going to talk about someone who I've written about on the show. And so this is someone who I got to know and I got to love. And she died fairly young as well. But why don't you tell us about Lena Richards?
Yeah, absolutely. The only person on my list not from Virginia. That's how much I love her. That she's included on the list. But I think Lena Richards, really, she's the first Black woman to have a cooking show. She's from New Orleans. I guess I'll give a little bit of background. She's born in the 1890s. She starts working as the domestic, I think 14 or 15. And so the family enjoyed her cooking so much that they paid for her to go to Boston and take cooking classes. While she's there, she's basically learning that she already knows all this stuff. And the people in her class are like, wait, tell us how to do this. Tell us how to do that, which I think is really cool. And so she comes back to New Orleans and she self-publishes a cookbook. And a publishing house picks up on it, and that becomes a success. And she opens a school, to teach African Americans in her community about fine dining and how to work in the hospitality center. And so it's just really, an interesting and robust life. And then she, has her own cooking show. So that's the super short version, but clearly, she's done so much. She's, she's the first Black woman to have a Creole cookbook that's not written by a white person. That's something that's really notable, and to be on television, to have the school, frozen foods. She was, it's like, what does she not do? Talk about Food Network and product placement. Like this is Lena Richards. And so she's just an extraordinary person who I think does not get talked about enough.
I really, really agree, which is why I put her in this group of 4 women that I wrote about. That was someone like Fanny Craddock in England, which you may not know, but who was this incredible, large and bouffant and very fun woman who used to cook in a tiara while on the Royal Albert Hall stage. And in the 50s, I had, I can't remember who else I wrote about now, but the one person I just really fell in love with was Lena Richards. And the reason first of all, let's just talk about her shows. The show started in 1949, and she started, there's one clip, and I can't even look at that, may even not look at that now. But it's 1949. It's an extraordinary period of time since she started.
Yeah. It's so difficult to wrap one's head around, right? Because this is separate but equal time period. This is before the Equal Rights Movement. It's before all of these things. Yeah. And so to see a Black woman on television, and she's cooking the food of her area and, of her people, so to speak, that's extraordinary. She's being authentically who she is. Yep. And authentically presenting, okay, so this is the food of New Orleans. This is not some sort of watered down version of it. This is it. And this is, this, I'm proud of this, and I want to share this with you. I think that's pretty extraordinary given the year, and there was nothing like that to even compare it to at that point in time.
Yeah, and I was going to mention as well the Creole cookbook, which I have and I love, and she was writing it, like you said, at a time we mentioned before. She was writing at a time when white people would take it into kind of a wider scale, which we can understand from them, but not from now. And she wrote this incredible book, and she was the first person, I think, writing there were people publishing, right, who we know in the 1850s and publishing one or two books, but this Creole cookbook was extraordinary. And have you got the book? Can you tell us about it? Please tell it, because I think it's a great book. I love reading it.
Yeah, I think what's so interesting about it, because Southern food is diverse. It is not some blanket statement, because the regionality is so incredibly different. And so to read, so it's obviously of its time, but let's take something as basic as gumbo, for example, which, at that point in time, how well known was that in Alabama or in Georgia or in Virginia? That would have been mind-blowing, to folks. And so I just, when I read it, I kind of think back to that time period and think this must have been a revelation to a lot of people to think about, andouille sausage. What is that? We're using ham. What are you talking about? And so I think that it just really was able to illuminate the eyes of a lot of people to recognize that Southern food isn't monolithic. And I think that people don't necessarily associate that with her, but I think that's a really incredible point, because it's Creole and it is Southern, but so different from what you think of as traditional Southern food. And I think that's something really extraordinary.
I think when you think of the range of Southern food, Gallagher with all the different, with all of this ranges, the Southern food. And let's just talk about that. The Southern food is so wide ranging. You're much more than I am, knowledgeable about that. Can you give some information about the types there? That would be really fascinating.
Yeah. So let's think about in South Carolina, for example, with Gullah Geechee food. And so you've got, red rice, and you've got these dishes that are very seafood focused, because obviously you're Charleston and those surrounding areas around the water. So that is so different from what we're eating like in Virginia, so whereas, the Tidewater area is very like water focused, but generally, the collards and the hoe cakes and those kind of traditional dishes, completely different, and as we just talked about in New Orleans, that's a whole different ballgame because of the French and the Spanish. So like that's almost, you almost don't want to call it Southern food, but yet it is. And so I think, when you go to the Deep South and you go to Alabama, they're not eating, a lot of seafood. It's largely landlocked. So, they're focusing on poultry and pork and those sorts of heavy dishes and gravies and that sort of thing. So like, just depending on where you are, you're going to get a different meal, and it's all Southern, but they're all completely different.
Let me just ask one question. This is just from me, which is one of the things I noticed about all of these people that you mentioned. They're all being long forgotten, I think, apart from maybe barbecue in a sense, but they're not looking back to where they. And I wondered, is that because of their African American heritage, or is that just because it's a long time ago? Or is it a bit of both?
I think it's a bit of both, but I think about Julia Child, right? So that's a while ago, but we're still getting HBO shows about Julia Child. There are movies coming out about her that Meryl Streep is in. So, her contemporary Lena Richards, where's that movie? Where's that show? So it's hard. It's hard to not see it as racial in that lens. But at the same time, it was hundreds of years ago. But I also think that it's because African Americans, their contributions to food were not largely written down. So because you don't have any sort of documentation, you don't have a lot of documentation to fall back on, you have to work to find these stories. You have to really delve in and really be looking for it. And so I think unless you're looking for it, you're not going to find it. You're not going to hear about it. You're not going to think about it. So I think it's those three things that trifecta is why a lot of these folks just don't get the due that they deserve.
Yeah, it's kind of the answer I was expecting, which is very sad, I think, because as I read through these, I just find them fascinating characters. They're amazing characters. They all connect so much. Before we go on to some fun questions, which we're going to just have some real fun with, I want to thank you because I think coming on to talk about these characters will help. This show, relatively gets a lot of listeners, and I think that we'll help get these names out there. One person will listen to, I'm interested in barbecue, so let me go and read about those people because I'll read about that. One person is interested in oysters, whatever it is. They're all going to go and listen to these people, and they'll go and listen to one or two. So that's the other question I'm putting to you folks. Go and listen to these. Go and buy some books. Go and really search out these people. Go and read some of the things that Debra's written already. Just go and listen to them, okay? So I'm really talking to you about that. But now let's have some fun, okay? Let's have some fun. We're going to do 3 questions. I do these to everyone who comes on. So you've talked to us about your past. Okay, fun questions. If Debra Freeman was a meal, what would it be?
If I were a meal, I'm thinking back to what I ate growing up and what was my favorite. And so it would be 2 things. It would be collard greens, but with white potatoes in them, because that's how my grandmother made it. Okay. That's extremely important. And something that I'm not sure a lot of people know about, but it would be fried crab, which is a hard shell blue crab dipped in batter and seasoned and deep fried. Whoa. and is messy and nonsensical, but is the most delicious thing on the planet. And so it's hard to find. You can't really find it in very many places, but it is spot on delicious. Oh my gosh. And now that I've said it out loud, I want to have some immediately.
Well, now you've said it, I want to go and eat it as well, which is a little difficult in California, but I could go and find it. Number 2. Now, if you could select any specific meal in history, so you have to go back or a period in history, what meal would that be?
This one's super easy for me. So the meal where Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton met in New York, where James Hemings made a meal for them while they figured out where the capital was going to be. And so I think there were artichokes and truffles. There was beef a la mode, capones that were stuffed with Virginia ham. That meal sounds extraordinary, and I would love to taste James Hemings' food. So that is the meal I would want to be at.
That is fantastic. Actually, again, I would really like to be there as well. Just quite frankly, even before Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton turned up, just for the meal.
Exactly.
That sounds really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what would you consider to be the greatest invention in food history?
This one's tough. But refrigeration. I think, and I'm sure that's a super common answer, but, if not for refrigeration, I wouldn't be able to taste things from different places. I would never be able to try them without the advent of refrigeration. So, shout out to I don't know who created the refrigerator and the icebox, but shout out to them.
Well, interestingly enough, we have a person coming on Eat My Globe on this season where, sometimes I write my own episodes and sometimes we have interviews and we spread them out. We have someone coming on who is writing a book called Of Ice and Men.
Oh my gosh.
And he will talk about all the whole of refrigeration, going back, though, to the times, going back to 3000 BC, where there were ice cubes who were brought in from the mountains and buried in like the deserts underground, and they were kept to keep things cool only by the kings.
Oh my gosh.
This goes all the way through. There was a kind of gap in the Middle Ages where they could have kind of got a little ice, but they'd lost a lot of their things. The Romans could make ice. It was really fascinating right up to the 18th century where there's a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? The scientists and people got together and started making ice. So it's really fascinating. So if you want to get a chance, he's a chap called Frederick Hogg. So do come and listen to him.
Yes, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's an amazing one, and I've done a little bit about refrigeration before. And one of my heroes is a chap called Thomas. My mind has gone now, but he's Thomas. I can't remember his name, but he is one of the absolute famous. He used to collect ice from Newark and from Boston, and he would put it in blocks, and he would send it to India. And so they could have ice in their drinks from what was it called? I can't remember what the river was he went from now, but he would get them to collect whole big blocks of ice and they would send it to India. I mean, it's amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, it really is. And so we're going to talk to him about that. Anyway, and finally, let's tell everyone where we can find you on Twitter and all of those. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I don't know if TikTok counts for you. I'm on TikTok, and it's mind you, I haven't posted in ages, but let's have a look. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. You can tell us where we can find you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Deb Freeman on Facebook and on Instagram and on Twitter. I'm Audiophile Girl, which is AUDIOPHILE Girl. And so I post pretty frequently about what I'm working on and other kind of interesting facts. So please follow me.
I couldn't find you on Instagram, which is why I was looking at. Is it the same thing as you've got on Twitter then?
Oh, it's the same thing.
Oh, I was just looking for Deb Freeman. Sorry. So it has been a real joy. I can't tell you. This has been such a pleasure to talk to you, to talk about all of these amazing people, mostly from Virginia and one not, which is great. It's just been so fantastic because I didn't know about as many of these people, and a lot of them are just new to me. So thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for being on Eat My Globe.
Thank you so much. What a treat to be on. Thank you.
Do make sure to check out the website associated with this podcast at www.eatmyglobe.com, where we will be posting the transcripts from each episode, along with all the references and resources we used putting the episodes together, in case you want to delve deeper into each subject. There is also a contact button, so please do let us know if there are any subjects that you would like us to cover. And if you like what you hear, please don't forget to subscribe, recommend us to your family and friends, and give us a good rating on your favorite podcast provider. That really makes a difference. Thank you, and goodbye from me, Simon Majumdar, and we'll speak to you soon on the next episode of Eat My Globe, a podcast about things you didn't know about food. The Eat My Globe podcast is a production of It's Not Much But It's Ours, and Producer Girl Productions, and is created with the kind cooperation of the UCLA Department of History. We would especially like to thank Professor Carla Pastana, the Department Chair of the Department of History, and Dr. Tawny Paul, Public History Initiative Director, for their notes on this episode. Also, a huge thank you to Sybil Villanueva for her help with the research and the preparations of the transcripts for this episode, which can be found on the website.